Good afternoon. We know it's Friday, 80 degrees outside, so thank you very much for joining us inside. Firstly, thank you to Claudio and Art Basel for making the conversation possible, and in particular to the members of this panel, Jose Roca, Mario Garcia Torres, and Hunter Braithwaite. Jose is living in Bogotá, in Colombia, and traveling quite a bit. Mario Garcia Torres is now residing in Mexico, and Hunter is living in Miami and is a journalist, so curator, artist, journalist. The discussion today is about criticism, art criticism, constructive art criticism. So I suppose we will first start by trying to define the terms and whether there's any validity in them. And I just had thrown one out for them, which was criticism should be provocative contribution that constructs the subjects of its discourse and produce change. But from the conversations I've had with the different panelists, I think there is going to be some different interpretations of what criticism is, in particular constructive criticism, that word, and then whether there is a different way of doing constructive criticism in Latin America, whether that's a valid word and term. So we're going to start the conversation with Jose Roca. We are, for the purposes of the conversation, Latin America was in the title of the conversation, but we're going to personalize it with our geographic context or historical context so that the conversation is more manageable. Jose, why don't we talk a little bit about you? And some of the questions that I threw out were really, how to define it, what role does it play, and the strengths and weaknesses, is it really necessary, and who's really doing the constructive criticism?
Okay, thanks for the invitation. When you sent me the title of the talk, I immediately thought about an article by Marta Traba. The title is Destructive Criticism, Reaction and Knowing When to Say No. And she said that there was a need for a destructive model of criticism as opposed to a constructive model, which is, and I quote here, complacent and conciliatory, which values everything, taking into account our hopeless mediocrity, considering ourselves as mentally weak, and that in this underdeveloped country, we do what we can. So she said, no, criticism has to be destructive. It has to separate grain from hay. And she applied that in a very precise and, let's say, merciless way, furthering her artistic agenda, which was modern art. And she wrote extensively and promoted the artists that she felt were sort of advancing the discourse in art in Colombia. Botero, Obregón, Grau, Ramírez Villamizar, Negret, and that generation, carrying into the mid-70s, and she died tragically in the early 80s. And of course, actively curtailing the development of other movements, like, for example, movements that were heavily influenced by the Mexican muralism, because she thought they were retardatory. So that model of destructive criticism prevailed after her death in some other critics. At that time, there weren't curators, at least in Colombia, that were publishing regularly in newspapers and in magazines their weekly notes about what was happening in Colombia. So fast forward to the 90s, to the mid-90s, when there is the emergence of a new generation of artists that hadn't been in a way taken into account, non-painters, not necessarily sculptures, and artists that were using space and processed in very interesting new ways. At the same time of the emergence of this new generation of artists, there was the demise of the older model of criticism. And for different reasons, Carolina Ponce de Leon, who was one of the main forces, critical forces in Colombia, left. She went to New York and then to San Francisco. Ana Maria Escallón, who was on the other side, because in this kind of criticism, you clearly had to take sides, and Maria Fernanda Cardoso was telling me that at that time you had really to pick your side, either the Museum of Modern Art side or the Banco de la República side, because there was no possibility of sort of being in both camps. And so she left. Ana Maria Escallón went to Washington. Eduardo Serrano entered diplomatic life as a cultural attaché of the Ministry of Foreign Relations. So he couldn't speak in public on behalf of the state, so he stopped writing in the newspapers. And José Hernán Aguilar also stopped writing. So that shift signified that other generation, among them myself, started taking that space. But we didn't take that space by writing in the newspapers. We were more interested in another model of criticism that would be the curatorial model, whereas in the modernist model, you would have the critic as an arbiter of taste that would sanction a work for good or for bad after it was done and entered the public sphere. With the curatorial model, you were mediating between the artist and the public, and you were acting critically before the work reached the public sphere. So that was a paradigm shift, and I would say it's a good way to understand the idea of the constructive criticism, because you are implicitly the curatorial act is an act of excluding things,
right,
by including some other things within a framework. So you were, instead of criticizing something else, you were creating your own critical corpus through the texts that you did and the exhibitions that you put together over a large expanse of time.
Then maybe for a second we look, Hunter, given that you on a daily basis, you primarily are a journalist, that's
Sure.
what you do your living from writing, a lot of it critical. How do you define it, and do the definitions that Jose just spoke, would they fit your parameters of?
I just wanted to,
Say.
just to close, I just would like to say that parallel to the emergence of the figure of the curator, the space in the newspapers was taken by the cultural reviewers that did basically quote from the press releases, so there was no critical space there. But the criticism found its way back into the public sphere through the blogs. I had one of the first blogs in Colombia, and I would say in the region, called Columna de Arena, in the late 90s, and for a decade. And many other people started sort of expressing their views through the internet, which was more horizontal. And particularly in Columna de Arena, there was this possibility of answering to the critic, which was not the case with a large sort of a column on a large newspaper. Anyways, and it, in a way, little by little, evolved into public forums, and that is where art criticism is played out now, at least in Colombia, in the public forums. But it's really nasty, because it has come all the way around as the anonymous or the heteronym way of writing. So you never know who is writing. There are some critical voices that write under their own names. There are many that have established a corpus that are fake names. So I would like to
right.
there.
So that's I think where we'll head, whether the criticism is personal or it's based on kind of this set of definitions that you were saying the curator makes. So what about in your daily practice? And you live in Miami, so it's in the North America region, however, with a bilingual community mostly.
For all intents and purposes, this is Latin America. I mean, for the next hour, I mean, we're going to kind of agree on a definition of this, or maybe we'll disagree later. But Jose, you raised a lot of really great points that I think are applicable here. I mean, there is this sort of, or at least there was this this sort of atrocious binary between just hatchet jobs and ripping things down on a personal level, or this sort of blind boosterism where, you know, you just want to talk about how great everything is. At the moment, we're kind of moving to a more nuanced role or position of criticism. To get back to what you said, yes, I am primarily a journalist, but I do other things because, you know, money doesn't really come from writing these days, and Miami is a pretty expensive city. So I publish my own writing locally and internationally. I'm the editor of an art magazine, so I'm working with other critics. I teach a journalism class, I give tours, and you find this sort of, this forced multiplicity across the arts in Miami, just because everyone, in order to survive, has to really vary themselves. So it all kind of comes back to the self, and I think that is a problem that we're going to have to address in this discussion and in further discussions. I looked up constructive criticism because when I think of that, I think of this sort of like HR corporate doublespeak, you know, if to constructively criticize something, first you give a compliment, then you criticize it. And to criticize means to tear down in this sort of vernacular usage. And then at the end, to make sure that there are no hurt feelings, you talk about something that you did like. And I think that's an all too common, I guess, path for the art writer. But I wanted to look it up. I went to Wikipedia and I looked up constructive criticism, and at the top of the entry it said, this entry needs to be rewritten because it reads like a personal essay. Can someone please rewrite this so that it is an encyclopedic essay? And it was dated July 2012. So over the past year and a half, that has just kind of, you know, flown by their standards there. The role of the critic in Miami is really, really kind of interesting. Art, beyond any sort of aesthetic question, has been tasked with creating money, providing an identity for the city. Miami is always looking for this sort of this identity. And now we have branded ourselves as an art city. This was known as Art Basel for several years, but now if you notice, the branding across town has kind of changed to Miami Art Week. Art's also been tasked with gentrification. So what you have is this sort of pressure from the outside on the critic to write positively about any and everything that happens within the city. And that's really, really, really problematic, because you have this sort of the trumpeting of things that perhaps should not be trumpeted. There are causes for this beyond these sort of economic realities. The fact that there's not a strong tradition of higher education in the city. That's just, you know, what needs to be accepted. It hasn't happened. And also the size of the community. It gets to the point where unless you're a sadist, you don't really want to say the truth about your friend who's a bad graffiti painter. So a lot of this sort of, a lot of it becomes criticism through silence, which I think you kind of got at with the role of the curator as critic. You know, we kind of pick what we want to pick what we want to cover, and then through that sort of steer arguments in one direction or another. However, if you're picking what you want to cover, you're usually writing positively about the art on display, you know, the venue, any sort of way that it was deployed. So the question would become, how do you know, sort of recalibrate your eye when you are talking about work that you really are behind, you know, for one way or another.
I'm wondering whether you were talking about what you pick or what the different kind of the parameters of what you are, like within your guidelines in how you cover it. Was it what you pick, or is it what the premise is to base the criticism on, Jose?
Sorry.
But no.
Oh, sorry. Maybe I misspoke. I heard that the argument went from this sort of destructive criticism to the curator, or from the modernist paradigm as of the critic as an arbiter of taste to this new paradigm of this sort of curator critic figure.
Okay.
Through and you get behind some movement or some artist, and then that way. But
yeah, what I said is exactly that, and that over an expanse of time, you can see a critical corpus emerge from the curatorial point of view.
Okay, so maybe at this point, like a pause, and going to you, who are the subject of this attention, whether positive, constructive, or arbitrary boosterism. How do you feel about that? How do you define it, the term? And as a person living in Latin America, is there a particularity to the criticism that you encounter?
Well, let me do my presentation, and then we take it from there. Can we get my slides? Is there a way that I can get my own slides? Like I can change them or not?
Yeah. Anybody who didn't take statistics 1, I'm happy to give a crash course later to explain Mario's presentation.
Can we get my slides? Yeah. Okay. So. Oh, that's great. Thanks so much. So, when I got invited, they told me that I was going to speak in something about art criticism in Latin America. And I thought, well, this is not something I really know what that is. And so I thought I'll try to figure out. And since I couldn't say something about it, I thought I'd just drive you guys through what I actually learned. And so in my work, I'm an artist, and in my work, I most of the time try to make the wrong question. And I think sometimes wrong questions lead to actually interesting truths. So the first thing that I did was not question myself what art is, or try to define what art is, for example, but to say, since when do we actually believe in art? Or since when do we agree on what art is? And I went to this funny thing, this funny program that I found online. It's called Google Ngram Viewer. Do you guys know what that is? It's a very interesting program, which is it's part of Google Books program, and what it does is that it counts the number of times that a word is being published in a book in an American in an English library, a huge library that they have compiled. So the first thing I did was to go and type in the word art, and I found this graphic, which I thought was really, really interesting. So basically this program charts the use of words from the 1800s to the 2000s, and I thought it was really, really interesting. Already in the 1800s was really high, and then somehow there's some kind of curves throughout the last 2 centuries. But surprisingly, from the 1960s, it's kind of going down. And I started questioning myself, what's going on? Why? I mean, I thought it was interesting to go to a library because that's what art criticism is at the end. We want to know how many times we've published art, how many times we talk about art. And I was kind of worried. I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. I mean, in a way, we believe that there's more art than ever now. There's more galleries, there's more artists, there's more art critics, there's more curators. But nevertheless, art is kind of in decline, or that's what this thing says.
Not being talked about.
So I said, okay, let's try to see something else. And I went to a different practice, which I thought it was kind of opposite to it, or far away from art. And I typed in science. And then I was kind of surprised that actually science, more or less, with its curves in it, more or less it's kind of going up, even though in the 1980s it was a little bit down, and then now it's a little bit up. So I thought maybe it's not the fact that we have changed where we do art criticism. I mean, at some point I thought maybe it's because because now we do art criticism in online or by Twitter or something. But it's not true. Science is kind of more or less still going up. Then I thought, let's do something else. Let's try something else. Let's try something else. So I went and typed in writing, which I thought also was part of our talk today. And I was very surprised to see that art is actually really not in decline. It's really been going up from the 18th century or from the 1800s to now. So I thought, well, really, this brings us back to art, and it's really, I think it's something that we should discuss, and we should think, why are we writing the world art less and less today? So from then on, I think I said, okay, well, let's go back to the title of this talk, which is Constructive Art Criticism in Latin America, and let's try to see what Latin America brings us, or where does Latin America bring us. And so I went and tapped in, oh, that's art criticism. Art criticism has been not in decline from the 1840s, which I thought it was really, really interesting. But then this program is really interesting. Then you can type in more than one term. So I went and typed in art and art criticism at the same time. And art is still there, but in relation to art criticism is almost inexistent, which was also something that I thought was kind of revealing for this talk. After this, I went and to review the title, and I said, let's type in Latin America, and this is what I got. I was really, really surprised. What the hell is going on?
What happened?
How come Latin America is non-existent? It's 1960s. In the 1960s, it goes really dramatically up. Then it goes down in the 1970s, maybe. Kind of through the 70s, 80s, there's nothing. This point is 1989. I checked in with the thing. And then it's going down and down. Hopefully it will keep going down. I thought it was really interesting that it actually started in the 1920s again. If we go back a little bit, the 1920s is also kind of the height of art, which I thought was really interesting. And anyway, when I got this chart, I was really, really thinking, like, how can I figure out what happened? How come Latin America, the term, was so popular and so hype in the 1960s? So, let me see where I am. So I started to try to go a little bit behind and said, okay, who was the first person who published the term Latin America? Who invented this? How come we are into this term, and where does it come from? So I started looking, and the farthest moment I could find where Latin America, the term, was published and acknowledged was actually in the 1830s. And it was this guy, Michel Cavalier, a French politician. That's the record we have, and he published it in the 1830s. And it was really interesting when I looked it up and started understanding, I discovered that actually Latin America was a term used for colonial reasons. Basically, Napoleon, or the people around Napoleon, when they saw Latin America, when they saw the term, they thought, oh, this is really great. Basically, America doesn't belong to the Spanish and the Portuguese. This will open up the opportunity for everybody who is in the Romantic language to actually go and get a piece of America. So he used that, and that's how he justified the fact that he was going to come and colonize a couple of little places. One of the places, I mean, not one of the places, but one of the results of this idea was the fact that Maximilian was established as the emperor of Mexico, and he stayed there for a long time. This was really, it was something that Napoleon was doing against, not only against the Spanish and the Portuguese, but also to get rid of Teutonic Europe and American, Anglo-Saxon ideas of doing that. So I really, when I got to this, I really started thinking like, should I really use the term Latin America? Should we really use the term Latin America? What that really means. And then I started thinking like, well, okay, so when was the first moment that term, Latin America, was together with the term art? And I started trying to think, what image can I get? And the only thing I could get, or the last thing I could even imagine, was this image. Oh, this is something else. This is really interesting. This is something I found this is a map from 1825, and this is what they defined as Latin America back then. I think it's really interesting that it actually covers Florida and some other states. But anyway, I tried to go, and this is the image I found where Latin America and art were together. And I thought, well, this is really a beautiful image, isn't it? And then I thought, well, maybe this could have been the end of Latin America, the end of using the word Latin America. But then, of course, it didn't happen. So I went again. I started thinking, okay, what else? Where else could I go, or where else could I find the place, or to understand why in the 60s Latin America was such a popular term? And so I went first to economy. I thought maybe economy will give us a response. So I started looking at what was happening in terms of economy in the 60s in Latin America. And this is what I got. I'm going to read it because it's numbers and things that I don't really understand. But it says, during the 1960s, the economy of the so-called Latin American countries was bare, to say the least. During the 50s, people were investing in their countries, and also the US became the leader of foreign investment. Nevertheless, by 1962, the growth per capita in those countries declined to zero. During that decade, countries were talking to each other and building roads in order to be able to advance their economies. Later in the decade, the economic growth per capita was 2.8 per year. We could talk about that forever, but I realized there was no response about our thing in the 60s in Latin America in terms of economy. There was no economy in Latin America. There was nothing to go and grab, really. So I said, okay, let's look at the broader scope. What else could be the response of the 1960s being so hip? So you might already be guessing what it was, and I went in to think, well, during the 1960s, there was a number of military interventions from the US into countries of the Western Hemisphere. Maybe that's the response. Let's look at that. There was as you know, there was a Cold War, something that had very little to do with Latin America. Nevertheless, that impacted a lot of countries in the Western Hemisphere. If we look at it, the US troops have been sent to Latin America for many, many years. In 1881, they went to Chile. In Nicaragua, they were in 1894. In Panama, they were in 1895, and so on and so on. The list is long, 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 long.
But we won't go through it.
What?
We won't go through it.
We won't go through not only the 1960s. So this is 1961. I thought this image was really interesting, because this is 1961, and this is Key West here in Florida. That's what it looked like if you will be looking towards what they believed was Latin America, which was Cuba on the other side. The US decided to send troops in 1958 to Panama. I mean, we can talk about it forever, but I'll just number them really fast. They also, in 1961, they went to Cuba. There's an interesting image of US planes flying over Guantanamo. There's this image of 1964. This is the US troops defending the Panama Canal Zone. This is Guatemala in 1966, 65, 66. This is an image of the revolutionary movement in Peru in 1965. There's no image of this, but there's a guerrilla in Guatemala where they also participated in 67. And this is something else in El Salvador in 1968. So the 60s, they really, really went down there a lot. In the 1970s, there was very little U.S. activity in Mexico, in the Western Hemisphere. This is the only thing they did. They went and participated in the coup d'etat they did to Allende in 1973. And from then on, there was nothing. Then in the 80s, of course, they started again. But for this reason, I thought this is interesting. Maybe this responds to the fact that during the 1960s, Latin America was so hip, or was published a lot this term. So again, I thought, well, what's going on? Should I use the term Latin America? Should we use the term Latin America? I went back there and started to think, well, maybe this makes something of a response.
So your problem is with Latin America and not criticism.
Well, wait.
You have 1 minute to bring it together.
Okay. So then I started thinking, okay, so what happened? Why did they go and get this thing? Surprisingly, I discovered that there's something called the Monroe Doctrine that was established coincidentally, surprisingly, also in the 1830s, when Latin America, the term was invented or first published. When they invented Latin America, Napoleon said, okay, this is great. This is justification to go to Latin America and take a piece of that. And in the 1830s, the US was publishing the Monroe Doctrine, which said, let's protect the countries in Latin America, so what we don't allow any European to come and get a piece of it. And that doctrine was that's what allowed them and actually made them cope with the fact that they could go to these countries and defend them. Again, I asked myself, what is Latin America? What is art criticism? And not only what is art criticism, but what is Latin American art? Is there a way to put that together? And then I came up with something else. I found this image, which I thought it was really interesting. This is an image that actually portrays what they believed was the Monroe Doctrine. And it's a painting by a painter called Claude Deland. And this is how they did. And I think, well, this is interesting. There is the Doctrine Monroe, and there's also Latin America in there. So I really thought if we could use that again. Now, not too long ago, I got this piece of news that I thought it was actually hopeful. And the character in that piece of news is
Secretary of
State John Kerry. This is the image of him. And I thought it was really hopeful because when this picture was taken, and when he said what he was saying in this picture, he got an applause. And after he said the line that he was saying, he said, yes, that is worth an applause. And so I'm going to read a little fraction of what he was saying in that moment. He said, when people speak of the Western Hemisphere, they often talk about transformations that have taken. But the truth is, one of the biggest transformations has happened right here in the United States of America. In the early days of our republic, the United States made a choice about its relationship with Latin America. President James Monroe, who was also a former Secretary of State, declared that the United States will unilaterally, and as a matter of fact, act as the protector of the region. The doctrine that bears his name asserted our authority to step in and oppose the influence of European powers in Latin America. And throughout our nation's history, successive presidents have reinforced that doctrine and made a similar choice. The place where this was happening, and he was saying that, is the event was the Organization of American States. And the line that actually created the applause was, Today, however, we have made a different choice. The era of the Monroe Doctrine is over. And he followed. The relationships that we seek and that we have worked hard to foster is not about the United States Declaration about how and when it will intervene in the affairs of other American states. It's about all our countries viewing one another as equals, sharing responsibilities, cooperating on security issues, and adhering not to doctrine. That's the repetition is mine. It's all about all our countries viewing one another as equal, sharing responsibilities, cooperating on security issues, and adhering not to doctrine.
Right.
But
and
to the
Mario?
decisions, I'm going to finish in a second. But to the decisions that we make as partners to advance the values and interests that we share.
But this is a good point to pause.
This really gave me hope. I thought maybe this is the end of Latin America. And so I propose now that we abolish using the term Latin America.
For that to happen, we have to discuss it.
Let's talk about our criticism. Let's open it to the floor.
That's okay. You hold on to that. Jose, definitely. I think the conversation is hijacked into the political territory. So you both have free reign to go after the term Latin America, geographic and the historical impressions bias of Mario. So Jose, I start with you on that issue, and maybe we could honor the topic at the end and discuss whether any criticism is of value.
So your question is whether should we use the term Latin America?
Well, it's been a bit hijacked into a political territory of this was supposed to be about criticism in our geographic region, but you seem to have an issue with there seems to be an issue of the geographic region.
It's a question of, it's an operative category. So we do what we do where we are.
Exactly.
And then that gets termed by others or sometimes by ourselves, Latin America or another region, Eastern Europe or Africa, those kind of generalizations that in a way put under the same umbrella areas that are completely different. I agree with you that Latin America is a term that doesn't really serve a purpose, in the sense that if you were to speak of art from Latin America, definitely you're not talking about the same scenes when you see what is happening in Panama or in Honduras, and when you're talking about a continent like Brazil or even Mexico that has also many different scenes that are concurrent. So the term doesn't really serve much, but at the same time, it serves to differentiate to situate what is being done in a certain geographic area that has a shared colonial history, more or less, and similar post-colonial histories, more or less. For example, in terms, I never use art, Latin American art. I never use that term. I use art from Latin America, and but in my title, the Tate is Adjunct Curator of Latin American Art. That was done, and I won't go there and say I have a political issue with the term, so please change the title. And I think maybe since we are there, my job there is interesting because I'm the Latin American curator for a collection that doesn't have a Latin American collection in itself. So whatever I do, which is advise them and work with the curators at Tate to identify pieces of art from the region that will be bought for the collection, those pieces don't enter a ghetto within the collection, but enter a dialogue with the collection at large, which is interesting. And you would think that you don't need to have a specialist in the region to have that. But I remember pretty well when I spoke to Paulo Herkenhoff, who was at MoMA on a sort of similar role. And he told me, I went to see MoMA at first, and I asked the conservator to show me the Latin American collection. And the curator said, here at MoMA, we don't collect geographically. But he said, but you tend to forget geographically. So that's why it is important to have someone in the region, because otherwise nobody will be the advocate for, say, Latin America, or prints, or photography, or film-based media. So there are several territories, not necessarily geographical, that need, in a way, to be articulated and maybe identified in order to enter this kind of dialogue. Otherwise, the mainstream will just sort of go by and leave them aside. That's just a comment.
Yeah, that's true. Hunter.
Oh, I mean, I really enjoy those sort of graphics and picking words and trying to trace out arguments around them. Yeah, like the history of Latin America and that being a very constructed and historical reality is, on one hand, really fascinating, but on the other hand, I don't know how different it is from saying something as the Mediterranean region, you know, that being the center of the world, or that sort of still spatial relationship that takes place in China. I mean, the Chinese word for China is Zhongguo, which means middle nation. So, like that, how that sort of, I guess, logic of center and outskirts, or colonized or colonizer, really plays out over the centuries and over the continents. Speaking as a Anglophone in Miami, it's a daily embarrassment that I don't speak Spanish fluently. However, that's just the historical reality of this moment. You know, we have in this community so many different language patterns that are taking hold that, you know, there will be like moments that are sort of lost in translation. That's just, you know, one of the I guess one of the things that you have to live with in this sort of society. But it's interesting with those Google sites. The books just came from American libraries. Is that? And that's the United States of America. Because I'd be interested to see how they were coming out of European libraries, or, you know, South American libraries, or things like that. And just to tie it back into, you know, one of the purposes of this talk, the sort of decline of art criticism, or rather the widening parallax between art and then art criticism, and still, like, you know, writing as being a constant growth. Perhaps that has to do with some other sort of realities that are completely foreign to this discussion, like, I don't know, the Dummy's Guide to Writing Code or something, you know, and that's why writing is going up, as opposed to any sort of like literary history that's being, I don't know, continued. But
I think that's a good point. Yeah,
Yeah,
Mario.
the thing is that Latin America it doesn't belong to me. It doesn't belong to my reality, not to my daily life. And I think to most people that live or are citizens of the countries that they call Latin America. And of course, the search I did was in American libraries. And I don't think that exists in Spanish. And it does exist in the British English, same system exists for a British library, and I think it's very clear to me. It was very clear that it's something that is so foreign that it only exists there. It doesn't exist in my reality. So it's a term that it's only applied for the people that are not in my daily life.
I'm not defending the term at all. Just
Right.
to make that clear.
So with that, why don't we open it to conversation with you all? If you all have some questions, there are microphones or comments on criticism, writing. I think we pretty much established that Latin America, yes. Why don't you stand up so we can see you?
Hello, sorry, I lost my voice. I just, first of all, wanted to say that since the 1960s, art has become more accessible to the public and more popularized. I mean, you see Van Gogh and you see Rembrandt on, you know, napkins and towels and umbrellas. I work at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I know this. You know, we sell them. And I was wondering, do you think that has something to do with art criticism and how it's accepted or by the public, or who now reads and consumes this knowledge?
Right.
Because I think it's like it used to be a very finite, like very, very, you know, niche market. Now maybe it's opening up to people.
Could I jump in on this?
Yeah. I think it's actually an interesting, who are we writing this for? Who is reading it? Is anyone reading it? And if no one is reading it, is that why you have to have 5 jobs? So.
Well, no, I mean, I think that the rise of this sort of public intellectual critic, someone like Clement Greenberg, in the mid-20th century was directly tied to the rise of the middle class in the States, which again was a historical reality based on industrialism during the war and the GI Bill. There were more people than ever who were educated, but they weren't that educated. They were curious about this sort of avant-garde movement, or these artists. But I think, like a lot of things in our culture, you've also seen the move towards just pure image, and text sort of going in a different direction. And you have these great websites like Contemporary Art Daily or Artsy or things like that, where it's just a constant barrage of images. And maybe that kind of relates to this sort of accessibility of a Van Gogh on a beach towel or something that you bring up. But
Yeah. Well, I mean,
Mario, how does it affect you?
Hello.
How do you take the criticism? Really, speaking of the criticism, not Latin America.
You mean personally?
Yes, like the article, the actual written word or the oral review.
I mean, I think it's fantastic. I don't.
Is it something
My work
necessary to your
hasn't been
practice?
reviewed like 15 times. I mean,
But
it
don't you
hasn't.
think that your own work is, in a way, since you are looking for those forgotten histories of the main history of art, you are like writing alternative art history, and in doing so, you are in a way an art critic more than just an artist. Definitely, right?
I think so. I mean, I think I'm trying from a very personal point of view to try to bring up at least a second narrative. In that sense, I think. I mean, then we get back to what is criticism, but.
But in your work, there is a lot of sort of digging in forgotten facts, and sometimes in a sort of blow-up strategy of finding the detail in the image that unleashes a fascinating story. But you have focused more on international figures, meaning European and American.
Sure.
Why is that?
Well, I think that's very interesting that you asked that, because it's precisely the same anxiety that I have to try to avoid using the term Latin America. It has to do with the fact that I come from Mexico. I come from a place that I believe we can be judged and be read the same way as anybody else in the world. I don't want the people to read my work as if it was Latin America. And in a very personal way, I look into those stories because every day I'm finding a way to try to identify myself with a different thing than my neighbor.
Right.
I'm trying to say again, I feel like I understand this person there. I feel like I understand this person there, regardless of geography, regardless of time, but just identifying myself with that. And that has nothing to do with geography, has nothing to do with political boundaries.
Jose, based on what you just asked him, what about you in your daily practice as a curator and as a member of a community that's defining a language, that's defining, you created an independent space, ostensibly that has a lot to do with what you felt was maybe lacking or needed to be expanded?
Well, my work, I've worked for many years as an institutional curator on a state-funded museum in Bogotá, and my job there, at least I felt it was my duty to sort of put Colombia in the regional map at least, and try to establish links not only with the rest of the region, but with other countries. And I did that for many years, and I stayed there for 18 years in all. And then I started working abroad. But at this point of my career, I decided to go back to Colombia and establish a place there so that I could do what I was doing before, which is creating local context, but without all the hassles and red tape of a large institution where you lose the control because you have to abide by many rules and decisions and things. So what I'm doing now is trying to do what I was doing before,
right,
but on a more local level, I would say almost neighborhood level, but doing the same, trying to establish a local context by working, on a daily basis, being there all the time. Because when you're an independent curator, you are a footnote in the program of many different institutions, because you have to follow your projects wherever they are. So you don't really construct anything, just your curriculum, but it doesn't amount to anything for a given community. So I am trying to do what I was doing, and I say constructive criticism, sort of following your title, by creating this space where I can carry out a program that bridges or links artists from all over with the local community in Colombia.
And Hunter, before you say a word, that was really the reason I asked you guys to talk about this, because I do find that if we are meant to move away from the boosterism, as you said it, I hadn't heard it like that, or the negativity, we have to create these spaces where it goes beyond our geographic or ethnic, or and just focus on the work.
Specifically beyond our disciplines too. I'm really,
right.
I mean, could you speak a little bit more about exactly what your space does, and specifically in the relationship between art and science or FLORA? Or?
Right. He has about a half a minute, or Claudio will kick us off. But go ahead and.
Sorry, I didn't get the question.
So your space in Bogotá, it deals specifically with the relationship between contemporary art and science, correct?
Yeah, and nature, yeah.
And nature. So this is just a fantastic model that I think could really go on to do great things for criticism. That idea of criticism existing in the sort of interstitial shadows between art and writing, to curate a space that deals with the relationship between science and contemporary art is an interesting analog for, I think, a possible path forward.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I must say, I don't know if we have time, but there is this joke in Colombia that there is a guy selling crabs, and there are two buckets, and one of them has a lid, and they say, the guy asks, why the other bucket doesn't have a lid? It says, those are Colombian crabs. Every time one tries to get out, the other will pull them down. So that's the kind of attitude in Colombia, very, very bad vibe. So I think that that is why I tried to steer away from the old model, because it was really nasty. And my generation, and people like Jaime Cerón and Carmen María Jaramillo and others that are my same generation of critics that turn into curators, or just curators, try to collaborate instead of applying that criticism,
right.
Because it comes from a long tradition of a bad understanding of what criticism is.
It's true. I think that can be applied to several different of the cultures that we all live in. Claudio, thank you for your patience and for having us. Everyone, you have access to the speakers right after this conversation, and thank you so much for coming.